he asked me to come down here last year, and the topic was counterinsurgency. And so, and you've done a reading, and some of you have some experience, I think. But what I really hope to do is talk more about leadership, okay, and how it applies, whether you're going to go active duty, whether you're going to go reserve, whether you're going to stay in the Army just for 4 years, or you might, do this for however long you choose to do it. I think, hopefully, some of the comments that I make pertain to that. It really doesn't apply to any one branch, but these are my observations based on my experiences, and I would just ask you all, certainly the combat veterans, if you have something you want to add, or you disagree, let's have that discussion. So the first thing that I would just say is, and you already know this, you were all on short final before. I think, is everybody going to graduate and commission this spring, or will there be some folks that next December?
We're still determining that.
Yeah, we don't know yet, sir, for every single one of them.
I know you, by the way. I looked at you and I said, good to see you again.
Sir, yes, every American in this room.
I didn't mean to call you. So the point is, you should be at a point, I would hope, where it's less hearing somebody blah, 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 but instead, the motivation is fairly high to try to soak up as much as you can, spend a little bit of time reflecting, believe it or not, because, in a few months when you're out there figuring out whether you're going to be a generalist or specialist, you're so consumed with the things that you've got to do. So most of these conclusions that I came to didn't come to me in advance. They didn't come to me from a book. Some of it, after the fact. Heck, Cullen hadn't even written his article the first time I deployed to Iraq as a battalion commander. We didn't even have a counterinsurgency manual. Okay, it had been written in Vietnam, it had been shelled, and we didn't even use the word counterinsurgency initially. We just didn't. And we certainly didn't train for counterinsurgency. So I guess the first thing I would tell you is, you have to pay attention to current events. You have to understand what's going on in the world. You definitely do. However much time you can devote to it, whether you're in international relations or you're foreign policy or you're a nurse, you got to have a little bit of an understanding, because the reality is we're going to go in places that our government determines to be important. And you have to at least have the context of why on earth, why might myself or my men and women be sent into potentially harm's way. So take advantage of that, and even if it's for a very short amount of time, because some of your folks won't even have that perspective, and you have to help try to provide that for them. Before we go any further, can you quickly, going around the room, just tell me who you are, what you're studying, and what your branch is going to be, and whether you're going active or reserve component? Because again, my comments are not geared towards any one branch, but I think it would just at least help me a little bit. So would you mind quickly just going around the room and... So you're a nurse?
Yes, sir. I'm Frederick Officer. I'm a nursing major, and I actually assess next week.
Okay, so you've got a little bit of... Did you graduate in June or May?
May, sir.
Okay.
So I'm Cadet Q. I'm going to through Signal Communications, sir.
Okay.
To the Signal Corps, and I graduate this May.
Okay. Active duty?
Active duty, sir.
Okay. Okay.
Cadet Labor, sir. Studying communications. I'm going to the reserve.
Okay.
Cadet Walker, sir. I'm American Studies major. I branched military intelligence, and I'm going active duty.
Okay.
Cadet Muldoon, diplomacy, military studies major, transportation, and active duty.
Okay.
Cadet Flowers, diplomacy and military studies as well, and psychology, active duty AG.
Okay.
Cadet Amano, MBA major. I'm going to active quartermaster, sir.
Okay.
Cadet Hill, sir. I'm studying nursing and ISS in the fall.
Okay.
Cadet Mahoney, sir. I'm a political science major, and I'm going to go active duty for the artillery.
Sir, Cadet Kanamitsu. I'm a history major. I'm going to go finance corps, reserves.
Okay.
Cadet Ung, sir. I'm psychology major. I'm going National Guard Medical Service.
Okay.
Sir, Cadet Carlo, diplomacy and military studies major, active duty MI.
Sir, Cadet Kim Alex. I'm a religion major here at the university. I branched chaplain candidate and have an education degree, sir.
Okay, so you go to graduate school?
Yes, at Priestley.
Okay.
Cadet Reading, Justice Administration, active duty infantry, sir.
Okay.
Cadet Kim Abraham, sir. Diplomacy of military studies, Signal Corps, active duty.
Cadet Harrison, sir, political science major here at UH, and branching active duty army.
I'm Cadet Kwan, sir. I'm studying computer science and I'm going to be going to Singapore.
I'm Cadet Kim Rachel, sir, and I'm a behavioral science major, active duty medical service.
Cadet Robin, sir. I'm getting a master's in business, and I'm going active duty in branch medical services.
Cadet Aoki, sir. I'm a major in political science and I'm going reserve infantry, sir.
My name is Cadet Benedict, sir. I'm majoring in business administration and branching engineering and going National Guard.
My name is Cadet Babalta, sir. I'm a computer science major and I branched active duty civil.
Cadet Gibson, sir. Diplomacy and military studies, active duty infantry, sir.
Cadet Rodriguez, psychology and political science, active duty AG.
Cadet Proctor, political science and international relations, active duty medical 4.
Cadet Manning, sir, communication master's study here at the University of Hawaii, active duty aviation.
Cadet Lowe, sir, diplomacy and military studies major, active duty infantry.
Cadet Turner, sir, justice administration major and active duty ordinance, sir.
Cadet Silva, sir. I'm a nursing major and I was
Okay, great, thank you for doing that, it just, it helps me a little bit. So, you did your reading last night, hopefully, starting things off. What is an insurgency? Anybody know? What's an insurgency? We're talking about counterinsurgency in here, but in order to have that discussion, you kind of have to understand insurgency, why it's used. If you can think of a historical example, somebody, speak up. Insurgency.
The Gauls who fought against Julius Caesar.
What were they trying to accomplish?
Independence.
Okay. Anybody think of some other examples?
I don't think insurgency is always what depends on how you look at it, if it's bad or good, but I guess the patriots of the American Revolution considered insurgency.
It's a political movement, typically, right? It's a political movement. A group somehow disagree with the current form of government. So in 1959, a bunch of revolutionary students in Tehran initiated a revolution to overthrow the government. The puppet, the Shah of Iran, was seen as an American puppet. They wanted it as an Islamic state. They overthrew a legitimate, quote-unquote, a legitimate government and replaced it with something else, an insurgency. It's a grassroots movement. The American Revolution is a perfect example of an insurgency. Some more recent ones?
Would it be like Egypt, sir?
What about Egypt?
Look at recent insurgency one day.
With the Arab Spring?
Yes.
Yeah, you could, okay, that was a, yeah, I mean, there's obviously a spectrum of violence associated with them, but there was, in this case, and it wasn't just Egypt, right? There was a couple other countries where there was a political movement to change political leaders. Iraq, all of our involvement in Iraq, it became an insurgency, and I'm going to talk about that, okay? So we overthrew a government, we being the United States and the coalition, and we went in, you probably all don't remember it. I'm obviously dating myself because I was battalion commander at the time, but shock and awe, the power and might of Uncle Sam, and we went in there, and President Bush was standing on the aircraft carrier, said victory, big sign, victory, May of 2003. What happened in July and August and September of 2003 and then into 2000, I don't know, 10, 11 and still. There was a groundswell of folks that didn't like the current state of affairs, and so they started to form an insurgency. In fact, there was multiple insurgent groups, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. How about Afghanistan? It's insurgency still going on. The Taliban used to be the quote-unquote legitimate, they were recognized in the United Nations. We didn't have formal relations with the Taliban as the U.S., but they were the legitimate authority of a sovereign country in Afghanistan. Okay, then 2001, things changed with Operation Enduring Freedom, but since then they've been fighting. They want to overthrow the elected government, and there's a lot of other examples. So the point is they've existed throughout time, and they are going to continue to exist. Whether or not an insurgency takes U.S. national interests, don't know. But the United States Army has found themselves many, many times fighting in this type of environment. Heck, when the United States expanded west, there was an insurgency going on. Now, the Native Americans may not have called it that, but we were imposing, manifest destiny, and we were marching to the West Coast, and we, being the United States, were expanding territories and power and resources. We expanded even further west through Hawaii, the Philippines. Anybody ever hear of the Spanish-American War? Okay. South America, Central America. So my point is that it's something that's happened in the past, and is probably going to happen again, to the point where it may involve the armed forces of the United States, insurgencies. So if you understand what an insurgency is, what's a counterinsurgency?
It's trying to just stop pretty much stop the political takeover from happening, pretty much, or
Exact opposite.
the exact opposite.
Exact opposite of,
You have a group that's coming in with a disagreement of an established government or entity, and their goal is to win the hearts and minds of a population there to coalesce around an idea that this is bad, we're better. Counterinsurgency is literally going in and saying, no, they're the bad guys, we're good guys.
yeah. It can make your head hurt a little bit if you don't understand. That's why these discussions about politics and international affairs and the relationships between parties, whether they be non-state actors or state actors, it's important because you and your soldiers will find yourselves in the middle of some of this stuff. I'm just telling you, you will. And it's not clear sometimes, and it's not black and white. But you have to understand what it is that the country's trying to accomplish first off, and then you as the counterinsurgent force, what are you being asked to do, okay? What are you being asked to do? Because in the end, why does America have an army? What's the purpose of its army?
Defense, sir.
To secure and
Maybe.
protect our national interests.
Say again?
To secure and protect our national
To
interests.
secure and protect our national interests, okay? Our national interests might be fighting a hurricane in southern Louisiana. It might be fighting massive forest fires in the Rocky Mountains. It might be containing Ebola on the African continent. It might be to overthrow a hostile regime or to prevent a regime from getting nuclear weapons or whatever the case may be. And in the counterinsurgency, it may be to support a legitimate government. It may be to form and develop and support a legitimate government. So it can vary on a very wide spectrum. And you have to understand what your mission is. So when we deployed, I took command of an infantry battalion task force in Fort Drum, New York, and we initially thought we were going to Afghanistan as a part of a normal rotation of the units going to Afghanistan. So we had done our leaders' reconnaissance, and we'd gone to the area, Kaus province in eastern Afghanistan, and we were prepared to do the relief in place. And less than 6 weeks from deployment to Afghanistan, I got a phone call at about 11 o'clock on a Thursday night from the brigade commander, and he said to me, Doug, sit down. You're not going to Afghanistan, your unit's going to Iraq. So I think maybe once in a while this guy's talked to you about agility, adapting to changing circumstances, and that's my first message is whatever we tell you and whatever you read about is good, but the situation's probably going to change, and so you have to be able to respond to that, and we certainly had to be able to respond to that because our frame of reference was Afghanistan. Some of us had had experience in Afghanistan. We were going back, certain problem, certain type of terrain, certain task organization, certain enemy tactics, techniques, and procedures, and now all of a sudden, on a dime's notice, you're going to shift your focus and you're going to go someplace different. And oh, by the way, you're not going to work for 1st Brigade, 10th Mountain Division, you're going to work for 3rd Brigade, 82nd, and you won't actually get your instructions until you get on the ground in Iraq. Any questions? Good luck. Didn't receive an operations order, 5-paragraph operations order. Didn't receive commander's intent. I learned as much as I could, we learned as much as we could from open source and secure information about what was going on the ground, but I'll tell you, we did not know what we were getting ourselves into. And we could have spent a year preparing, and I don't think we would have known what we were getting ourselves into until we got there, okay? But I'll tell you a couple of the first key ingredients, and then these are part of my tenets. I kind of came out of this experience and then subsequent rotations, I went back to Iraq a couple times after being a battalion commander, and I've got experience in Afghanistan. I kind of had an opportunity to then kind of say, okay, Colin's got his 28 principles. Well, I learned some lessons too, and that's what I want to talk about. But the first one is, the first lesson is, with whatever amount of time that you have available, prepare for the worst contingency. Prepare for the worst scenario, whatever that is. If you prepare yourself and your organization for the worst, my experience says that you're going to be able to adapt with agility and some intellect. You're going to be able to adapt yourself and your organization to a new set of circumstances. But you got to prepare for the worst, because you have a moral obligation to do nothing less than that. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the first imperative. You got to prepare for the worst. And I think the Army does a very good job of that, regardless of your branch that you're going to. The Army, that's the bread and butter. In the end, we're going to fight and defend our nation's wars, broadly defined wars, okay? But you're going to prepare for the worst. So if you're an infantry platoon leader, you're going to learn how to do battle drills and deliberate attacks and react to contact, and you're going to prepare for that. If you're an aviator, you're going to know how to employ your weapon systems, and you're going to be able to fight as a combined arms team. If you're an engineer, you're going to have all the capabilities for mobility. You get my point. You may not use all of those, but that's the first imperative, is prepare for the worst. And that's exactly what we did. And we found that throughout the deployment, those essentials, we used them. We may not have used them every day, but the mantra you've all heard, shoot, move, communicate, it actually has valid application. Shoot, move, communicate. But I'll tell you, we didn't know what counterinsurgency was. And we certainly didn't know what type of quote-unquote enemy we were up against. And we had to figure that out on the ground. We went into an area where there was no U.S. Units. There had not been U.S. units. They did give a little context, because I know it was a long time ago. You had the March to Baghdad and the Thunder Run, and then kind of the coalition spread out, and there was more ground to secure than there were troops to be able to secure it. And that's why things like the Antigua, we just didn't have the troops to secure all the critical infrastructure, all the key hospitals and government centers and universities, et cetera, et cetera. So there had been this void where there was this huge, shock and awe in this Thunder Run, and we pummeled the Iraqi armed forces, but then we kind of spread out to try to secure all this area, and then there was a lull period in the summer where some of these factions were able to start to form and to organize, and you got to remember that no matter what the situation, in most situations you find yourself, there's probably going to be a political majority. There may be an ethnic majority. Well, in Iraq, it's a very, you had the question of, do they have a unified Iraqi vision of the country? My experience is no. They probably never will, but that's just my experience. Because we were in an area just south of Baghdad. It was about 40 to 45% Sunni Muslim, and the other percentage was Shia. If you know anything about that, those two sects of Islam do not get along. And we were plopped right in the middle of both of them. And those two groups hated us for different reasons. Hated us being the folks that wore the American flag. They hated us for different reasons. We didn't know that. We all had the view, just like our political leaders told us, with they're gonna thank Allah that you're there. And they're gonna greet you with open arms. And that's not what happened. The Shia initially did. We had pretty good relationships initially with the Shia, not with the Sunni. Why? Because the Sunni were now dispossessed. Okay, we got rid of the Ba'ath Party, no longer legitimate. All these working professionals who were making a good income in Iraq, the U.S., the Coalition Provisional Authority cut their paychecks, said, go, you're unemployed. We disbanded the army. They had the largest army in the Middle East, and we disbanded it. So now you've got literally hundreds of thousands of people that are trained to kill, that no longer have a job, that still have access to weapons and know how to use them. No functioning police force. no functioning legitimate government. It is literally the Wild West. You were there at the same time as me. It's the Wild West. The Wild West.
Scary. I was only a company commander.
And so you become basically, and I don't mean this in a narcissistic way, you are the king of your domain. You've got to establish law and order. You've got to sort out who's the enemy and who's not, who's legitimate, where can I gain support, I being the United States and the coalition, who can we work with, because we were given no mission. We were told to go into this area. We developed a mission statement. We developed a mission statement in the first 30 days to try to figure out what the heck we're supposed to do here. We were in an area with a large industrial capacity. There used to be a command economy where the state ran all the industries. So large agricultural factories, large automotive factories, all of that stopped with the invasion. So in addition to all the armed forces that were now unemployed, and the Baathists, which included teachers and doctors and all your professionals, you had no one was working. They still had Iraqi dinar that for a while were legitimate. So a black market started very quickly because people have to survive, right? It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the first need is security. So the first mission for the counterinsurgent, and it does echo in all the 28 articles, is you've got to figure out how on earth am I going to secure this population? We were in an area of 250,000 people. I had a 700 soldier task force. How on earth am I going to secure 250,000 people with 700 soldiers? Secure the population, okay? The other thing that we had to somehow figure out was we've got to get some kind of local face to the security forces. So the first thing that we did, not just my unit, but they stood up what was called the Facility Protection Services. Some folks that could wear a uniform that could basically be a security guard, to guard electric plants. Oh, by the way, we were housed in the largest electric plant in Iraq. So this is a huge oil-producing country, but we got to have power, you know, because if you go back to the whole thing about insurgency and counterinsurgency, what the coalition told the Iraqi people was, we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. He's a tyrant and he's a dictator, and we're going to install a democratically elected government, and we're going to make your life better, mom and pop Iraqi. And so when you go in there and you completely pummel a society, and that's exactly what happened, you pummel a society, you take away all formal structures of law and order and authority, you eliminate the economic drivers of the country, you better quickly reestablish the order, or there's going to be all these other factions competing for power. You get my point and what we were up against? And I'll tell you straight up, we were naive. We did not know, I don't think anybody knew at that time that this was going on. And when you look at this stuff in retrospect, if you spend any time and you look back at, you know, the history of these two, and I'm not bitter, folks, okay? I'm very proud of my service and my soldiers' service, but we as a country should have known better some of the things we got ourselves into. But in the end, you put soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine out there on the edge of this, and you're asking them to figure it out. You all figure it out. You can't make excuses. You can't say, I wish I'd have known, or I wish I had an order. You're on the ground every single day, and I had you will have two competing priorities all the time. I got to accomplish the mission, but I've got to take care of my soldiers. And those two don't always support each other. And sometimes you got to make tough decisions, and I'll give you an example of that. It goes back to one of the imperatives of securing the population. We figured out fairly quickly that we could not hide behind the wire in our forward operating base and just commute into the cities to do our work. We figured that out before anybody told us in an article. We had to get out there, we had to build combat outposts, and we had to live in the city. Now you may say to yourself, well, that just is common sense, Mulbury, but I'll tell you, 2003 and 2004, that was not common sense, was it?
No, not even close.
Okay?
Even into 2006, it was still not.
The reason why that's such a big deal is the soldier didn't think that was such a good idea at first, and the leaders didn't think that, because you're exposing yourself to a little bit more risk. if you're gonna take over a factory complex and you're gonna turn that into a combat outpost. But guess what? If you're right there in the city center, and I fortify it, and I'm closer to the police station that we partner with, and now I can send patrols out and I don't have to expose them to the roads, and I've got multiple ingress and egress routes for my dismounted patrols, we can secure ourselves actually better that way. Maybe initially there's a little more risk. So you gotta balance risk every single day. You gotta balance the mission, and you gotta balance your men and women, okay? And sometimes you gotta make the tough decision of which of those two is more important. And when you make that decision, you've gotta explain to folks why you've decided to make, because it's not gonna be popular. And I know you've been told this, but it's not a popularity contest for any of you, okay? Maybe it is an ROTC or whatever, but it is not a popularity contest when you get commissioned and you're a leader. Okay, so you have a responsibility to your chain of command, you have a responsibility to your immediate commander, you have a responsibility to your subordinates, you got a responsibility to the husbands and the wives and the moms and dads and the folks that you've been trusted to take care of. You gotta figure that out. We didn't understand what the enemy situation was. God, I love military intelligence officers, but they didn't understand either. They had to figure it out. It's not at all clear to you who it is that's shooting at you every day, who's trying to blow you up. And so you have to spend, yes.
I was just gonna say, will you explain, sir, real quick, how we grew up in the Army and what we studied as infantry officers?
Yeah, I mean,
we were gonna fight?
we were trained to fight a conventional enemy, okay? So we studied orders of battle, and I can tell you, as a lieutenant or a captain, I can tell you, the orders of battle of the Soviets and the Russians and the Warsaw Pact and blah, blah, blah. But how do you organize yourself to fight counterinsurgents? You're not quite sure where they live, you're not quite sure who they are, you're not quite sure how they're organized, you're not quite sure what they're trying to accomplish, and you've got to figure all that out. And you've got to adapt your organization, and you've got to adapt your processes to figure that out. And that's exactly what we did, and that's what everybody did. I'll tell you that the first thing we had to figure out was what the heck are they fighting for? And they were fighting for different things, the groups in our area, as I've indicated. For the Shia, now remember, these are the ones that, for the most part, openly, they were very friendly with us. They wanted to provide us information and they wanted to provide us support because they were the majority. Okay, but they also had hidden militias. So by day I might be, a legitimate kind of person, but at night I've organized a Shia militia, and we're going to ethnically cleanse the Sunnis in this area, and we're going to clean house. And I think that occurred a lot, and it's occurring again right now. There's fears of these sectarian wars. So you've got the Shia there. The Shias have had a 40 or 50-year grudge because they've been the minority. And Saddam Hussein's minority, the Sunnis, had most of the glory and a lot of the wealth. So the Shia want that back. The Sunnis want the way it used to be. And those are really the two dynamics that we had in the area that we were dealing with. You had multiple Sunni insurgent groups, okay? And that changed over time. So initially there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, okay? But there was the Muhammad's army, and there was the Order of the Naqshbandi, some of the former Baathists. There was 2 or 3 or 4 variants of insurgents. They all had kind of different goals. At that point, none of them were Islamic based. They just hated us, basically. We were seen by occupiers. Some of them tolerated us, the Shia, because they knew in the end they were gonna, if they were patient and they worked with us, they would benefit more. The Sunni were dispossessed, and we were seen as occupiers, and they wanted to take back what they used to have. So we had to figure out that, and then we had to figure out how we were going to secure the population. When you're doing that, you've got to figure out, and Colin, I think, talks about this a little bit, is you've got to figure out what are things that we can do to separate us, being the coalition or the future Iraqi government, from the insurgents. What can we do to separate and isolate the insurgents? Because my experience was that 90% of the population was ambivalent. They didn't care one way or the other. They just wanted it's the same things we all want. They wanted to be safe. They wanted to be secure. They wanted a better opportunity for their children. They didn't really care who provided it for them. If it was the U.S., great. If it was somebody else, great. They were very ambivalent. So we had a tough sell, right? Because if they, many times, in fact, thousands of times, people would come up to me in interactions on patrol or whatever, and they'd say, you know, the US put a man on the moon, but you can't give me running water and functioning electricity 24 hours a day, United States. What's up with that? How do you respond to that, first off, when they're right? But you gotta figure out things that you can do to separate the insurgents, because they're you know, it's a chess match, but they're looking for ways to discredit the United States. And they're looking for their ways to tell their narrative or their story, right? And so you gotta have a narrative. You as a leader have gotta have a narrative. You know what? Does everybody understand what I mean when I say a narrative? A narrative, what I use for a narrative is, what are the things that I want to tell the locals when I'm interacting with the locals? What's the message that I want them to remember when they interact with Mulbury or Mulbury soldiers? And what's the narrative I'm going to tell my soldiers? We all want to know why we're doing what we're being asked to do. I don't just say, Anderson, go do it. I say, Anderson, I need you to do the following, and here's why. So what's the narrative? And that narrative is going to change as your mission changes and adapts, but you've got to have a narrative, right? Because ISIS has got a narrative. You may not agree with it, but they've got a narrative, and it resonates with some people. And it was the same situation with us on the ground. And all you guys that have been in combat, you know, and women, you know what I'm talking about. There's a narrative going on. And so if you're fighting a counterinsurgent type of force, you're trying to demonstrate legitimacy. You're trying to demonstrate that we are credible, that we can secure you, we can protect you, and that we're going to stabilize the situation so we can establish a government, and eventually your life is going to be better. We're credible. And so you've got to figure out what your narrative is, and then you've got to come up with a set of actions that match the narrative. Because you all know that actions speak much louder than words. So I can say all sorts of things as a leader. But if my actions and my behavior and the things that I choose to do and not do don't mirror my words, then my words don't mean anything. Well, that's what the locals on the ground are looking for every single day, wherever you face yourself. And I'm pretty confident, regardless of what situations are in the future, you're going to face a kind of a situation where you're dealing with people out on the streets. I mean, that's what we have armies for, to secure terrain and to secure population centers and to secure people. So you've got to have a narrative, and you've got to spend time thinking about that narrative, and it's got to be perceived as legitimate. And I know we weren't always perceived as legitimate, because, you know, things happen. But you've got to establish that narrative, and that's an imperative. You've got to understand and develop that narrative.
So I just want to add on that, but the narrative has got to be something that, you know, is not going to, you know, they can't use against you when you don't come through with what you've demonstrated, you talk about. That was one of the most important things.
Yeah.
You know, because we didn't know what we didn't know, and we would, you know, a lot of us would run our mouths and say, like you guys always do, oh, I'll bring water, and, oh, I'll, you know, dig a well, and.
Well, that's the other point, is that you cannot promise something you can't deliver. And so the narrative for me was not a big lofty United States of America narrative. The narrative was, okay, this is what Task Force 132 is going to do, and I promise you we're going to do the following. Yes?
So question for you, so how do you go about establishing this narrative when you have so many missing variables with no time, no information,
It's
no
going to change. That's why I say it's
no
going to
plan?
change. Your narrative is going to change, and it's probably going to, you're going to have to. But you got to go in with some kind of narrative, because immediately you're going to have both of those populations that you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to deal with the host nation, and you're going to have to deal with your soldiers. The narrative is going to change, and it probably changed 100 times for us. Okay, but you got to have that as a starting point. I would argue. You got to know what you're trying to accomplish, and you got to have a general idea how you think you're going to accomplish it, and then you got to communicate it.
And then I'll tell you this too, and it also changed every year, every 15 months, right?
Well, yeah,
Every rotation, right? And all the successes that were done for a particular task force, a particular organization, you know, the next group would come in and go, oh man, I can't believe y'all are doing it that way. That's not how I'm going to do it.
Another way to think about it, Give, is that when you go in, you're not going to have the specificity that you want. Okay, so your narrative is going to be general. But as you develop the situation, as you work with the population. You build that shared trust and that shared understanding with not just your organization, but then with the population that you're working with. You're going to define that specificity. And that's how you can kind of work through what your prioritized list of goals are that you can try to accomplish with the population.
But see, with that change, you break that consistency. Every time the new rotation ones are coming in, so you want to be strong.
And that's part of the challenge.
That's
So
part
how
of
do
the
you-
problem.
challenge.
Yeah, that stability, it just
But you
goes out
can't
the
affect
window.
that, you can't affect that as a leader, I mean, because you're only there for a finite amount of time, okay? But what you've gotta remember, and as rotations went on, I think we got a lot better at that, there's things that can be done, both as individuals, organizations, and institutions, to try to minimize that turbulence, okay? And there's things that we did to try to do that, but going in, my point, you're absolutely right. If I'm living, if I'm Joe Araki, and you're my third or fourth commander, absolutely, there's turmoil of that, and there's inconsistencies and stuff. So I'm not saying to discount it, but you can only do what you can do, and you're trying to set conditions for whoever's the follow-on. But while you're there, my only message is you gotta have a narrative. And Captain Morton said something that's really important. We'll get what you're trying to accomplish is you're trying to establish trust. Okay? That, to me, if there's a lot of different words we're searching for, one of the key words is trust. Because people have got to trust you. And so what we were trying to do is we were trying to establish first trust. One of the first things that we did was we stood up a police force. Because remember, when there was no police force. So we started training both Facilities Protection Service and police. And we had to establish trust with them. And we also had to work with the populace to trust the police. Because just like the comment about American education system being different, in a lot of societies, police are not trusted. Police are not seen as, the local beat cop. They're seen as repressive. They're seen as corrupt. They're seen as heavy-handed, and we certainly had challenges with that too. Okay, but you're trying to establish trust. Another group that when we first arrived here, they had just had some local elections for a district council. Now, it wasn't recognized at Baghdad, but in the eyes of the local folks, it was really the first attempt at a democratic election. So the other group that I focused a lot of time to establish trust was the district council, helping them to learn how to govern. Because these are folks that had never operated, they didn't know what Robert's Rule of Orders was. So I'm an infantry battalion commander trying to teach them Robert's Rule of Orders and parliamentary procedures. Never saw that in an FM manual or a counterinsurgency manual, okay? But you gotta be think creative and teach them, and I tried very hard. I'm not gonna tell you how to govern, but I'm gonna try to teach you the importance of governing. And you're gonna figure that out. And that you're representative. You represent the people on the streets. Yes.
Thanks, sir. Team, another way to look at this, kind of water it down, is it's very similar to your time with an organization as a platoon leader or a company commander. You have a finite amount of time to make changes that are sustainable. And so what you can set conditions for the follow-on leaders who are going to take it and try to take that organization to the next level. Obviously, it's much more complex. Okay, but the tenets are very, very similar. You're creating that narrative, that message, where you're driving your organization to. It's just now your organization has many more facets to it. It's kind of similar. Does that make sense? I've talked to some of you guys about that. That you're making sustainable changes in an organization that can be effectively handed off to the next leadership, and that they can continue to make that group grow.
You had a question or comment?
Sir, one of the things that's been on my mind, and when you started off, you discussed Vietnam and how that basically got put on the shelf. My question would be, how much do you feel as an organization we've really learned over the past 2 decades? Because what I would often see is like a handoff that goes poorly, or a leader who's unwilling to take the lessons from a previous command. So as an organization, are we just repeating the same mistake and putting some of those same lessons learned back on the shelf?
I think the Army, both individually and organizationally and institutionally, made huge strides from 2003 through 2010, 2011 to be a learning organization and learn. Now, I'm not going to discount individuals and personalities. my fear is that, that with the, the downsizing and the reduction of the force, we've already had a huge outflux of combat veterans with irreplaceable experience. So you gotta remember, the generation that I'm talking about, in 2003, there were no Vietnam veterans. There were Desert Shield and Desert Storm, a few Somalia veterans, a few Just Cause veterans, some folks had been in Haiti, but you didn't have a lot of combat veterans. And so now we've got, after, this 14 years or, 13 years of kind of perpetual combat, my fear is that we're gonna lose all that, and it's gonna be this, it's the circle of life thing. We're gonna go back to this 324 is gonna be a relic, and it's gonna get put on and and I don't know what to do about that. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but.
It almost seems like there's an organizational resistance within the United States military to conduct counterinsurgency. And I don't know how we as an organization can really address that.
I had a question to bounce off of that, because as we were reading, I know he did a lot of his work in the journal, he did a lot of his work in 2006, and Colonel McAllister came up with that concept of embedding, he came up with that real big push, and why is it that it didn't, this didn't resonate throughout the force a lot earlier, than it did later? How do you feel about that?
Well, you get, every, it goes back to the comment he made, at every level, you've got commanders and people in charge who emphasize or prioritize different things. And so we could spend hours talking about this, and I don't think we have the time to do that, but the focus changed, and so the narrative changed. And so initially, if you think about 2003 and 2004, multinational force Iraq, the four-star headquarters, kind of the political military headquarters, the focus at that time was all on building Iraqi capacity. So we're gonna do everything we can to build a military, to build ministries, to get a functioning government. Now, I'm not saying that was right or wrong, but you then had a shift, because as the insurgency gained momentum and the Iraqis' capacity was gonna take longer, now you've got a gap. If it's gonna take us 10 years to build capacity, and we can't afford 10 years because the insurgents are fighting, they're fighting each other, they're fighting us, and casualties are mounting, we've gotta change our focus. And then our focus became much more what I would say is counterinsurgency, secure the population, hence the surge in 2006 and 2007. So the focus completely changed, okay? So, it's, in a little bit, you gotta sway with the direction of the wind, what the four-star says you're gonna do, but at the same time, you've gotta be able to figure out, for my area on the ground, what I think is the best approach. And so, these are all good questions.
What I take from a leadership perspective, and this is gonna be applicable at all levels, how a leader of an organization defines and measures success for that organization is gonna drive what the goals are of their subordinates. Does that make sense? So if you look at Vietnam, okay? Secretary of Defense, President of the United States, the things that they wanted reported to them every single day was body count. That's how they measured success. How many bad guys have we killed? Vice, when we grew through the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global war on terror, it started out maybe on, hey, how many raids are you doing and things like that. But then it grew into, well, hey, how many more people in the population have running water? Or how many hours a day does this town have running electricity and things like that? So it's the metrics by which you measure success of your organization will help determine what the focus is.
So would it be safe to say that it's not so much an organizational resistance and more or less the rapid changing environment that we're in? Would that be?
Well, no, I think it's safe to say I think it's safe to say there's been, history shows us that the Army has been averse to counterinsurgency. You can come up with a lot of reasons for it, and some people say, and this is way beyond the echelons that any of us operate at now or will for a while, is there's struggles at the highest levels for appropriations in Congress and where the money is. The money's on the big weapon systems, the Apaches, the Abrams, the Paladins, battleships and F-15s and F-22s, and so therefore go where the money is. And so you need all those types of things to fight high-end North Korea, China. That's one school of thought. I don't know if that's right or wrong. All I'm telling you is I think it's pretty likely that we're gonna find ourselves in these kind of situations again, because we have in the past. you had a comment or a question.
I was just wondering, so what was your narrative when you first started, and like, how did you know that that was an acceptable narrative to?
Well, you get feedback. So honestly, I don't remember exactly what my narrative was, but it goes back to you're looking for feedback. So you're looking for feedback first from your leaders and your soldiers, and that's another message for all of you, is that I believe that as a leader, you listen more than you speak. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I believe that. It doesn't matter what level of command you're at. So you've got a group of folks with ideas and experiences of their own that may approach things a little bit differently. You've got to be confident enough in your leadership ability to take the time to ask and listen to other people. It's hugely effective because they'll have these ideas. So I don't remember specifically what that was, but the other thing is you got to validate your narrative against the reality that's on the street. So if I come in there and say, we're here to make your life better, and they laugh at me and they spit at me and they throw rocks at me, which they all did, and some shoot at me, then I know that my narrative, I got to work on my narrative. So I don't remember specifically what it was. I just know that I had one and I know it changed. But the other thing that's real important, and Captain Morton said this too, and it's another imperative, you've got to define success for your organization and your soldiers and the populace. And that then ties into your narrative. What does success look like? Because folks, you may not be told, again, that 5-paragraph field order that we didn't get, nobody told me what success was. Nobody told us what success was. You've got to figure that out. And success was not the number of people that we captured or the number of enemy KIA. That was not success. It might have been for one mission. So what is it, what does success look like? And sometimes success